we've come to think that the controversy over whether Pluto is a planet or what exactly it is was recent, right? It wasn't. It started almost immediately after it was discovered, particularly as its properties became more well known. There was real big questions about whether this could actually be what they called Percival's planet, the planet that was predicted by Lowell and by some of these others. For one thing, it was really difficult to see how it could be massive enough because it was small. It was very dim when it was discovered. So if it was massive enough to actually be the perturber out there, the thing that was causing these anomalies in the position of Neptune, it would have had to have almost been blacker than coal, basically. Almost no ability to reflect at all. It's albedo, the technical term for that. Would have had to have been less than 1%. Or it would have had to have been made out of something really exotic, right? Some compressed matter of some kind. So that was one kind of strike against it from the very beginning. The other was it had a really weird orbit. All the other planets up to then orbited in relatively regular way in the plane of the ecliptic. Pluto was inclined relative to the plane of the solar system by quite a lot. It was a much more eccentric orbit than most, and was more an elongated orbit, to the point where it actually crossed the orbit of Neptune. There would be times when it was closer to the Earth and closer to the Sun than Neptune was. So there were doubts from the very beginning that it could have really been the planet X that everybody was expecting to find. They were expecting to find something big, and that's not what showed up. Tombaugh himself acknowledged that. There's some quotes from him that basically acknowledge the fact that this may not have really been the thing they were looking for. But the thing that really brought all this to a head, these discussions went on for years. But the thing that really brought it all to a head was in 2005, something called Eros was discovered, which is almost a carbon copy of Pluto, basically. About the same size, almost in the same place, and possibly even in a similar orbit. And so the question became, is Eros the 10th planet? In which case, there must be a bunch of planets out there, because there was this whole kind of discovery of the outer solar system going on then, and people were finding these, mostly a group at Caltech, were finding these things pretty frequently. So a whole bunch of little things were popping up. And every time another one of these would show up, so there's Eros right there, there's Pluto. Every time one of these things would show up, and they all got these increasingly interesting names, in my opinion, the question became, are these more planets or not? And the questions got to be so difficult to answer that finally what was done was something that I think surprised a lot of people. It was what they essentially did was, for the very first time ever, the International Astronomical Union defined what a planet is. It had never been done up to that point, at least not formally by the IAU. And so the gist of it all was a planet had to do one of three things. It had to orbit a star, had to be big enough so that its gravity made it a sphere, and it had to clear its orbit. In other words, it had to be the only thing in its orbit around the sun. And this was the one that Pluto did not meet. So in a sense, it wasn't like, everyone decided Pluto's not a planet. What they did was they defined a planet in a way that Pluto didn't meet its criteria.
Jupiter's not a planet either.
Neither is Earth.
That's right.
There's now something in our orbit as well, and that's kind of leads up to
That's
the point.
problem.
You know,
Yeah.
and so the word kind of got out that Pluto got demoted. It's now a dwarf planet. It's not a real planet.
Yep.
And to make things even more complicated, now there's some evidence that there maybe really is a much more massive object out there. So there's a new planet X, or I think they're now calling it Planet Z or something like that, some other letter of the alphabet, that orbits way out there, and it's kind of throwing things off. It's making things move in a weird sort of way. So there's kind of a search going on for that. If there really is this new Planet 9 out there, it's probably pretty good sized. It's way bigger than Pluto. It's quite a bit bigger than Earth, actually. So it's kind of raising questions again about, what's the real structure of the solar system and what is a planet and all this stuff. I have not followed this story that close lately. I guess there's some pretty good compelling evidence that there may be something out there. There's others that are arguing that there really isn't. Some people have said that maybe it's not a planet, maybe it's a black hole that's left over from the primordial universe. I honestly don't know the answer to that. Well, what I do know is that it kind of illustrates the fact that, we're still discovering the solar system. Basically, there's still a lot of unknowns, which is interesting to me because, back in the 80s when I took astronomy classes, the solar system was like, going to Vegas and playing the $2 table. It was the dead game, right? The really cool stuff was all the galaxies and this glowing stuff. So it's kind of gratifying for me to see that, what would seem to be like the most familiar part of the cosmos is still surprising us.
Oh, yeah.
And so I want to wrap this up by giving a few what I guess would be personal opinions about why I think this matters and why this story is still so interesting to me personally. And it actually has something to do with a little bit of the conversation we had last month when we were talking about, when we think about the solar system or you see pictures of it in textbooks or somewhere, it looks like this really kind of, it looks like this very orderly place, right? You tend to see things like this where there's all the little planets lined up and they're all in these very regular orbits, and it all looks very orderly and neat and kind of boring, to be honest with you. The reality of it is sometimes you see this, right? There's the planets, and then there's the asteroids, and there's the Kuiper Belt and the Oort cloud, and all these things out there that are part of our solar system that we don't typically think of. But even this kind of simplifies the problem, the situation a little bit, makes it look kind of neat. What it really is this sort of cloud of stuff, and all that stuff has different properties and different characteristics, but it all points back to what I think the most interesting question of all this is which is how did it ever get there? And so where the question I think gets interesting in my mind is this whole notion of defining a planet, right? So we have kind of capital P planets, right? The ones that we think of as planets, and that's the 8, right? And then there's planets with a small p. And what's the difference? And in my opinion, is this really even the right or best question to be asking? Because when I look at these, and I'm preface this by saying, I'm not a professional in this. This is not my science, and so I'm probably kind of intruding into an area that I don't have a whole lot of business being in. But I've reached a point where I don't care about stuff like that anymore. So when I look at these, to me, the first most natural division that comes to my mind is these 4 and these 4.
Yeah.
And I have a really hard time thinking about them as being the same thing, right? These 4 are rocks and these 4 are gassy balls, basically. But then really, it's like, well, these 2 and those 2, these are frozen, right? These are not. That doesn't seem right. So is it these 4, these 2, these 2? But then, well, that one, it's not really exactly like these 3. So is it that one and these 3 and these 2 and those 2? Are they all the same thing? Or should we have different categories for those? And, you get into what in classification is called the problem of lumping versus splitting, which is, do you make big inclusive categories or do you make small numbers of exclusive categories? And there's really no right answer to that. But what seems like a right answer to me is that these things, I can't really think of any criteria other than those 3 made up rules that unite these. And even as we've said, those don't unite these anymore. I don't know if any of the planets really meet that 3rd criteria exactly. So maybe that's not the best question to ask. Maybe a better question to ask or a better answer to come to might be, there are no capital P planets. Everything is a planet of one type or another. So we have this term dwarf planet, which people tend to kind of take personally, in some cases. But, you know, a dwarf tree is still a tree, right?
Mhm.
So maybe we should be thinking not so much in terms of there are big P planets and little P planets, but there's just a bunch of different kinds of little P planets. So
Well,
there's
a term like planetesimals.
or something.
That's another way you get. You know, when we talk about this, I remember when Clyde Tombaugh was asked about it when there was questions. You know, even shortly after the discovery, and he said, "Whatever you call it, it's there."
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you know, you look at the actual solar system, and again, it's just this kind of cloud of stuff. And the big interesting question, I think, in a lot of people's minds, including mine, is, you know, how did it get there? And a lot of the most important clues for that are not the big P planets; they're the little P planets. I mean, the stuff like, you know, Gary's looking at there's hugely important clues in that to understanding how what we see came to be what we see. So that to me is kind of what the more interesting question is. I'm sure if there were, you know, real planetary scientists in here, they might be throwing things at me right now, but that's kind of what I see. So I want to say one last thing about Clyde Tombaugh. When all this was happening, there was a tendency to kind of think of him, kind of redefine him as not the guy that discovered the ninth planet, but the guy that didn't discover a planet. I think a better way to kind of think about him, at least from the legacy of science, is that he's the guy that discovered the Oort cloud. Because really what Pluto is a piece of that, right? It's a scattered disk object, which is the innermost part of the Oort cloud. And that, in a way, is way more important than finding a planet. So I think his scientific legacy will be, at least what I hope his scientific legacy will be, is he'll go down in history as the guy that discovered the Oort cloud, or the guy that found the first representative of the Oort cloud. The person that comes most, or the people that comes most readily to my mind that did something the most similar to that in astronomy was Arnold Pinsias, who discovered the microwave background radiation by mistake. Him and what was the other guy's name? Robert Wilson. They found something that people knew was already there, but they found it. Right? They were the first ones to observe it, and in a way, I think that's Clyde's legacy. He found something that people suspected were there, but he's the first one that really observed it. So that's what I see as his.
They were trying to get rid of that noise that was causing the issue, and they ended up finding out that it was the 3-degree background radiation.
And after they cleaned all the pigeon crap out of the
And
antenna,
went through a lot of pain.
they found out that there was still noise there. Yeah.
One thing about Tombaugh too, when he made the discovery of Pluto, he didn't call it a planet. He said in his telegram that he sent to the Minor Planet Center, he said, "This is a trans-Neptunian object." Never called it a planet. The International Astronomical Union jumped in and said, "Well, that's a planet."
Yeah.
And he said, "Oh, whatever."
Yeah, that's true.
You know, he knew exactly what it was.
And it's really interesting to read, at least to me, I don't know, it depends on what you're interested in, I guess, but it was really interesting to me to read some of the more kind of academic writing about all of this. And it really did get caught up in the kind of
Flurry of
science politics of
Yep.
the
Exactly.
you know, of the 20th century, and national prestige.
Yeah.
And there's actually a whole history of that in the whole planet discovery game. That Lowell for a while worked with Pickering, another American astronomer. They started off as colleagues and I guess ended up as mortal enemies. But they were racing to but a lot of what was motivating them was a kind of nationalism. It's like we don't want to be this science backwater. We want to be out on the cutting edge. And it was kind of fit with the sort of American psyche at that time of kind of trying to emerge as a more modern nation. So it got, and the Europeans that were looking at all this thinking, oh, these crazy Americans, they are totally out to lunch.
But Pickering was also, I think, one of the guys that said, this guy doesn't have the education, therefore he's not valid.
Well,
there's not.
And that's true. But Lowell, though, he had a degree from Harvard. So he was not a he didn't have the, I guess what I would call terminal degree, but did anybody then?
Yeah.
Really? I mean, I don't even know if you could get a PhD in astronomy in the US until sometime in the 30s.
I'll bet it was physics or nothing.
Or math.
So.
But yeah, Lowell was he was obviously a gifted person. I think, there's a tendency sometimes to be kind of dismissive of him as, this crackpot guy that had this crazy idea about Martians. That's not entirely wrong, but, he did some really innovative things and created a research institute that's still going strong and still doing really state-of-the-art work. So.
Especially with the help of Discovery.
Yeah.
Discovery Channel was the one that submitted the funding for the 2.4 meter. It's out on the Mesa now.
Yeah. It's near the same place where the Naval Observatory has a field station, right?
The Naval Observatory had a station at Flagstaff.
They
were actually on Flagstaff.
It's the same general area as
Yeah, but I think it's like 30 miles southwest of there, I think.
Yeah.
Or southeast, maybe. I don't know.
But this has always been kind of a compelling story for me because, as a young kid, I was just captivated by this idea of this young guy that, gets on a train and goes out to Arizona.
There's definitely a lot of story behind it, and it is a fascinating place.
Yeah, when they were discussing, whether Pluto should be counted, one of the things was the nationalism. This is the only planet supposedly discovered by someone in the United States. Well, not in Europe, really, going back.
Mm-hmm.
So there was a lot of that kind of nonsense in there. And the thing is about science is you don't just accept, you have to test, and you have to verify and whatever. I still remember the look when they announced that they had found the Higgs boson, and Peter Higgs was in the audience, and just the look on his face, he fought this all his life. But at the same time, you don't want the crackpots in there either, the goat gland doctor type people. And that's the thing about science, you have to question, and yet there's questioning, and then there's attacking, and you get all the egos and the money and everything else involved in it. It crawls forward, but sometimes it takes steps back.
Well, one of the things my advisor used to tell me was, science advances one funeral at a time. I hope one of these days people aren't saying that about me. But anyway, so that's it. That was my presentation.
Very good.
Thank you.
Jessica, so I wonder with the Webb telescope now, being able to see potential origins of the universe, how that will change some of what we know about how planets came to be and how we define them.
I think that's actually one of the things that they are going to allocate a lot of time on it too, is looking at exoplanets.
Yeah.
And, the Webb is optimized for far infrared.
Right.
Because they want to look for things that are a long way away and old. And those have redshifted down to that part of the spectrum. So,
Well, and they're also looking for that wall.
Yes.
Where there's opaque behind it.
Yeah.
And they're looking for something they're never going to be able to tell us there.
The surface of first scatter.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Yeah.
Well, it's kind of like, even the definition of planet changed after, Kepler, when they started finding these things out there, and they were raining diamonds, and they were doing all this stuff, and they found objects out there that didn't really fit what they thought a planet should be, but it's what they thought. You have to expand the
Well,
mind.
the planet definition has been a controversy for a long, long time, long before Pluto even, I think.
Mhm. Well, Planet X, there, with Vulcan, planet Vulcan is out there, and all this other kind of stuff. And I've read a number of different things that mathematically, they think that, Jupiter and probably Saturn were in the inner solar system at one time, and then they moved back out, and all this other kind of stuff. And when you look at some of the exoplanets, they'll find a big thing, and then they're thinking, is that a planet, or is that a planet falling apart? Is this a dust? the whole thing about definitions, there's so many different
Well,
options
and
out there.
just the gradient between a large planet and a small star is pretty vague right now. The brown dwarf is basically a big planet that's at that point where it takes off.
Yeah, the stars.
The more we find out, we can't classify stuff.
That's right. Yeah, that's the whole thing. We want to pigeonhole things, and there's things
And
that
they
are
just
jumping back and
they
forth.
just don't fit. That's right.
They don't fit. It's like the discussion of the planet versus other, and when you have they have protoplanets, you've got dwarf planets, why don't you just say it's this thing, but they don't want to do that.
When I started,
I mean, there's some validity to that because when
Yeah.
you study, you have to know, but at the same time, sometimes we do go too far, I think.
when I started looking at asteroids, there was 5,000 known asteroids. 5,000. There's over 1 million now.
And what percentage do you think that is of all the ones out there?
I think it's a large percentage of the larger ones. I mean, I think we've found most of the larger ones within some, the problem is you always have some uncertainties. You always have some outliers that are going to show up later. But I think we've got 99% of the big asteroids discovered now.
Yeah.
I think we're about there. I think we've basically discovered the entire main belt down to, a quarter kilometer or so.
Well, if you want to go
You're
into
not finding many
definitions,
of them.
if there's something out there the size of a baseball, asteroid means star-like. So if you can see it, does that mean it's an asteroid, it's star-like, but if you can't see it, it's not?
The problem you're going to run into there is exactly what happened. Exactly what happened to me at some point in time. I called everything an asteroid, and they said on NPR they called it meteors. A meteor that's large enough, a large meteor is what they said, and they got so much flack for that because people called up and says they're asteroids. There is a difference between meteors and asteroids. It really isn't, by the way. It's just size.
It's a rock.
It's just
It's
size.
a rock. It's a rock. Yeah, and if it's out there, it's an asteroid. If it's in here, if it's coming through, it's a meteor. What's a meteoroid? I mean, we get a little bit carried away sometimes. You say tomato, I say tomato, sort of thing.
But asteroid, I think, is a misnaming that's just been carried forward.
Well, that's what I mean. Aster is Latin for star, so yeah. And
Well, that's true. I mean, it's a definition problem too. It's the same thing as the planets. There are various degrees of sizes. Most of them are rocky material or metallic material or some combination of each, but they're all different sizes.
Well,
Where are you going to draw a line?
That's one of the things when you study some of these exoplanets, like they have found some that shouldn't be possible, like they have gaseous rock, this kind of stuff. And the universe has got a whole lot more out there than we'll ever understand, let alone categorize.
One of my discoveries was what's called a virtual impactor, and it's about 15 to 20 meters in diameter. So is that an asteroid? Or is
If
that
it
just
lands
a
in
big
your
rock
backyard,
in space?
Doesn't matter what you're going to call it.
Yeah, that's right.
You're going to call it a moneymaker unless it hits the roof, and then it's an insurance problem. So,
Yeah. The
Yeah.
moneymaker after the explosion.
Yeah.
As long as you're far enough away from it.
Yeah, that's right.
There was a big fireball in Colorado yesterday.
Was there?
And they caught that.
That's another one too. is a
Was
fireball,
but was
nobody
that a
sees it.
man-made piece? I mean, that's the thing you don't know.
I don't know. I didn't read that carefully through the article, but I just saw a picture of it.
Chinese are starting to throw a bunch of stuff back. So
Yeah.
Well, it's like when Russia went up and they blew their satellite
right.
apart and made all this stupid debris. You're just sitting there thinking, let's throw some of your little cosmonauts up there and duck into the space, whatever like that. It's doesn't matter what's up in space if you're attacking the Ukraine.
well, and there we can get into a whole different discussion.
Twitter was pretty
Elon
funny.
Musk.
was pretty funny today because people at some point realized that there's Russian and American astronauts in the International Space Station right now.
Yeah,
So
I
it's
know,
like,
and they
that's
didn't even know
awkward.
about this.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, that is very.
I've heard people, and I think this is so well, they define as wars as just two groups trying to figure out whose is bigger. And that's really what it comes down to. And, I don't know. I
Well,
just want to look at the sky.
yeah, I think that's
Sometimes
probably,
it's nice when Earth is
That's
crazy
probably
to think
the
about what's
deal.
going on outside of Earth.
It's crazy enough here.
Yeah.
Sometimes I want to, I'm still looking for my cave front property, I just need my own water source and a cave and a couple of chickens and I'm out of here.
Well, I hear you can buy parts of Florida now a little cheaper.
Yeah, well, it's gonna be underwater in a few
Right.
years, so I ain't going nowhere.
That's what I'm saying.
Somewhere in the state, there's now an old missile silo for sale, which would probably be a pretty safe.
Oh, I saw
Right,
that.
yeah, they have
Somewhere
several
out around
around here.
Hamilton
Yeah.
or something.